She boarded business class, expecting comfort, but the flight attendant turned her flight into a humiliating nightmare. However, no one could have predicted how this story would end. Find out how one humiliation became the beginning of an amazing revenge that turned everything upside down. Layla Brooks adjusted the cuffs of her tailored blazer as she entered the bustling terminal. Her every step exuded quiet confidence, a result of years spent climbing the corporate ladder and breaking barriers. She was used to being the only black woman in the room, the one whose presence invited whispers, speculation, and, sometimes, outright skepticism. Today was no different. The business lounge for first-class passengers was quiet, save for the soft clink of glasses and murmurs of conversation. Leela had arrived early to ensure she could settle in before her flight to London, where a high-stakes presentation awaited her. She approached the counter, handed her boarding pass to the attendant, and received a polite but curt acknowledgement. As she settled into her seat in the lounge, she noticed the subtle glances cast her way. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair sitting nearby leaned toward his companion and whispered something, both of them glancing briefly in her direction. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the one that came whenever she was silently judged. But Layla had long ago mastered the art of the nonchalant smile, the kind that conveyed confidence without betraying the sting of such moments. "Mrs. Brooks, your flight is now boarding," a lounge attendant announced, her voice soft and formal. Layla nodded, gathered her belongings, and made her way to the gate. The pristine, carpeted walkway leading to the plane seemed to promise comfort and luxury, an illusion as Layla would soon discover. She stepped into the business class cabin, greeted by the crisp scent of leather and a meticulously uniformed flight crew. As she approached her seat, she noticed the subtle stiffening in the posture of the flight attendant stationed near the galley. The woman, whose name tag read Miranda, forced a tight smile. "Your seat is here," Miranda said, gesturing perfunctorily to the window seat. Her tone lacked the warmth Layla had overheard moments earlier when the same attendant had cheerily welcomed another passenger. Layla nodded politely and slid into her seat. She placed her leather laptop bag beneath the seat in front of her and pulled out her tablet. She had no intention of letting the slight bother her. She had a major deal to close in London, one that could expand her company's reach into global markets. That was what mattered. But the undercurrent of tension in the cabin was palpable. As other passengers settled into their seats, Layla felt their eyes on her. She couldn't shake the sense that she was being sized up, silently questioned. One man in a pinstriped suit leaned toward his companion and muttered something that ended with a chuckle. The companion glanced at Layla, then quickly looked away. She pretended not to notice. "Can I get you something to drink, Miss Brooks?" Miranda asked, her voice strained. The words seemed perfunctory, devoid of genuine hospitality. Layla looked up, her calm gaze meeting Miranda's. "Water, please," she replied. Miranda nodded curtly and disappeared into the galley. When she returned, her movements were mechanical, almost begrudging, as she placed the glass on Layla's tray table. Layla murmured a quiet, "Thank you," but the warmth in her tone wasn't returned. The flight crew began the safety demonstration, and Layla's mind wandered to her presentation. She mentally reviewed her talking points, the slides she had spent weeks perfecting, but her focus was repeatedly broken by the quiet snickers and murmurs that seemed to ripple through the cabin. She glanced around, catching fleeting glimpses of passengers quickly averting their gazes. As the plane taxied down the runway, Layla leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. The rhythmic hum of the engines was usually soothing, a signal that she was on her way to another opportunity. But this time, it felt like the calm before a storm. The first hour of the flight passed uneventfully, though the tension lingered. Layla noticed small details that confirmed her suspicions: the way Miranda seemed to avoid eye contact, the deliberate care she took with other passengers' requests while rushing through Layla's. When she asked for a blanket, Miranda claimed they had all been distributed. Yet moments later, she saw another passenger receive one. Layla tried to ignore it, but each slight chipped away at her patience. She reminded herself of her own resilience, the battles she had fought to get to where she was. She had faced worse, she told herself, but something about the collective atmosphere, the whispers, the dismissive smiles, the passive-aggressive comments, was different this time. Her neighbor, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and an air of entitlement, leaned over at one point and asked, "So, what brings you to business class? Work trip?" Layla turned to him, her smile unwavering. "Yes, work. I'm the CEO of a tech firm." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Ah, impressive. I wouldn't have guessed." Layla held his gaze. "Why not?" He hesitated, then offered a tight smile. "Just a feeling." The exchange hung in the air, the subtext unspoken but loud. Layla turned back to her tablet, dismissing him without a word. As dinner service began, Layla once again found herself on the receiving end of indifferent service. Her tray was brought last, and when she pointed out that her order was incorrect, Miranda shrugged. "It's all we have left," she said curtly, before walking away. Layla sat in silence, her appetite gone. She stared at the cold, unappetizing meal in front of her, fighting the urge to let the indignities of the day consume her. This wasn't the first time she had been treated this way, but it felt personal in a way she couldn't ignore. The hum of the engines grew louder, blending with the whispers and occasional laughter that seemed to orbit her seat. Layla clenched her fists beneath the table, willing herself to remain composed. She reminded herself that she had a goal, a purpose beyond this moment. But the shadows of prejudice hung heavy in the air, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight attendants prepared for the evening service. Layla adjusted her seat slightly, hoping to drown out the subtle but persistent tension that had been following her since boarding. She wasn't new to these microaggressions. Cold stares, dismissive tones, and the invisible barrier between her and the others in the cabin. But tonight, they seemed to weave together into something darker. Miranda's voice broke through the cabin noise as she approached. "Can I get you anything else, Ms. Brooks?" she asked, her tone carrying a false sweetness that bordered on mockery. Layla glanced up from her tablet, her instincts urging her to say nothing, but the dryness in her throat made her nod. "A glass of water, please," she replied, keeping her voice even. Miranda's smile tightened, and she turned toward the galley without a word. As she walked away, Layla caught the faintest exchange of glances between Miranda and the male flight attendant, Tom. They smirked at each other, their interaction cloaked in an air of shared amusement. Minutes passed, longer than they should have. Layla's focus drifted back to her work, but her patience wore thin. The other passengers around her had already been served their requests with efficiency, their trays now cleared away. She tapped her fingers lightly on her tray table, debating whether to press the call button, when Miranda finally returned. She placed the glass on Layla's tray with an exaggerated motion, the faintest glimmer of amusement flickering in her eyes. "Your water," Miranda said, her voice dripping with false politeness. Layla murmured her thanks, her attention already shifting back to her tablet. She reached for the glass, its surface cool against her fingertips. The first sip was meant to soothe the dryness in her throat, but instead, it froze her in place. The liquid was warm, acrid, and unmistakably foul. Layla's eyes widened as the taste hit her, followed by a wave of nausea. She gagged, her hand jerking away from the glass and spilling a few drops onto the tray table. The stench followed, sharp and undeniable. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her composure cracking for the first time. "What is this?" Miranda turned, feigning innocence as she returned to Layla's seat. "Is something wrong, Miss Brooks?" Layla's heart pounded, her body locking between fury and disbelief. "This isn't water," she said, her voice low but steady, as if forcing herself to remain calm. Miranda glanced at the glass, her lips twitching with what looked like suppressed laughter. "Oh, really? Maybe it's just the airplane water. It can taste a little different." The audacity in her words sent a wave of heat through Layla's body. "This is not water," she repeated, louder now, her voice cutting through the cabin's ambient noise. Passengers around her began to turn their heads, curious murmurs rippling through the rows. Miranda's expression hardened, and she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Perhaps you're overreacting. It's just a drink after all." Layla's composure finally cracked. "Overreacting? You think serving me this is acceptable?" She held the glass out, her hand trembling with suppressed rage. Tom approached, his brows raised in mock concern. "Is everything all right here?" "No," Layla snapped, her voice firm. "This isn't water, and I want an explanation now." Tom exchanged a glance with Miranda before turning back to Layla. "I'm sure it's just a mix-up, ma'am. Let's not cause a scene." "A scene?" The words landed like a slap. Layla straightened in her seat, her gaze locking with Tom's. "You think I'm causing a scene? After this?" Passengers around her leaned closer, their curiosity sharpening into whispers. "What's going on?" one of them asked aloud. Layla's neighbor, the man in the shop suit who had earlier questioned her presence in business class, chuckled softly. "Drama over a glass of water? Some people just love attention." Layla shot him a look that silenced him mid-laugh. "This isn't just water," she said, her voice cutting. "And if you're too blind to see what's happening here, maybe you should keep your comments to yourself." The cabin felt heavier now, the tension thick and suffocating. Miranda's faux concern had evaporated entirely, replaced with a thinly veiled smirk. "I'll get the senior flight attendant for you," she said, her tone clipped, before disappearing into the galley. Layla sat back in her seat, her pulse racing. She reached for her phone, her fingers moving swiftly to snap a photo of the glass. The act felt like reclaiming control, a way to document the indignity she was being subjected to. She opened her notes app and began typing, detailing the events as they unfolded. When the senior flight attendant arrived, his expression was tight, his patience already worn thin. "Mr. Brooks," he began, "I understand there's been an issue?" "An issue?" Layla repeated, her voice sharp. "Your crew served me a glass of God knows what and tried to brush it off like it was nothing." "Ma'am," he said, his tone measured, "I assure you this must be a misunderstanding. Our staff would never intentionally—" "Don't patronize me," Layla cut in. "I know exactly what this was." The man straightened, his polite mask slipping for just a moment. "I'll have the matter looked into once we land." "That's not good enough," Layla said firmly. "I want answers now." Her voice rang through the cabin, silencing the whispers. The senior attendant glanced around, aware of the growing audience. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "please lower your voice. We can discuss this calmly." "Calmly?" Layla laughed bitterly. "Your staff just humiliated me in front of an entire cabin, and you expect me to sit quietly and wait?" The man's gaze faltered, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Miranda and Tom, who stood nearby with stiff postures and tight lips. "We'll discuss this in the galley," he said, gesturing for them to follow. As they walked away, Layla felt the weight of the stares around her. Some passengers looked sympathetic, but others seemed entertained, as if her humiliation was a spectacle for their amusement. Her neighbor leaned in again, his voice dripping with condescension. "You could have just asked for another drink, you know." Layla turned to him, her eyes blazing. "And you could have minded your business, but here we are." The man leaned back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Touchy, aren't we?" Layla ignored him, her focus shifting back to her phone. She opened the camera app and began recording, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "This is Leela Brooks," she began, "and I'm documenting what can only be described as blatant discrimination aboard this flight." She panned the camera to the glass, zooming in on its contents. "This is what I was served when I asked for water, and when I confronted the staff, I was met with mockery and dismissal." Her words carried through the cabin, the passengers around her watching with a mix of intrigue and unease. Layla didn't care. She was done being silent. The plane jolted slightly as it descended through the low-hanging clouds, the captain's voice breaking through the cabin speakers to announce their approach to Heathrow Airport. Layla's fingers were still trembling as she clutched her phone, re-watching the video she had recorded. The stares of the passengers around her, once faintly curious, had turned into a sharp focus of attention. She could feel the weight of their judgment pressing on her from all sides. Her mind reeled, replaying the events of the last 2 hours. The humiliation, the condescending looks, the dismissive tones. They all coalesced into a storm of anger that simmered just beneath the surface. Yet, despite the rage she felt, Layla forced herself to maintain her composure. She had learned long ago that her anger, justified as it might be, could easily be weaponized against her. The senior flight attendant returned to her seat as the plane leveled out, his face carefully neutral. He bent slightly at the waist, his voice deliberately low so as not to draw further attention. "Mr. Brooks," he began, "I want to extend our sincerest apologies for any inconvenience you may have experienced during this flight." "Inconvenience?" Leela's voice was a razor's edge, cutting through his carefully rehearsed tone. "You think what your staff did to me was an inconvenience?" The man straightened, his composure wavering under her piercing glare. "I assure you, we take all passenger complaints very seriously. I've made a note of the incident, and once we land, our ground staff will address your concerns further." Layla leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but laced with fury. "What happened wasn't an inconvenience. It was deliberate humiliation. Don't think for a second that I'm letting this go." The attendant's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I understand, ma'am. Our ground team will be ready to speak with you upon disembarkation." As he walked away, Leela couldn't help but notice how quickly his demeanor shifted as he greeted other passengers, his voice regaining its pleasant tone. The contrast was glaring, a reminder of the unspoken hierarchy that governed how people like her were treated. The plane touched down with a smooth thud, and the usual rustle of passengers preparing to disembark filled the cabin. Leela remained seated, her phone still in hand, as she composed a message to her legal team. She wanted them prepared before she even stepped off the plane. Around her, the tension was palpable. The other passengers seemed eager to exit, their conversations hushed as they stole glances in her direction. She caught snippets of murmured exchanges. "Do you think she'll sue?" "Probably just looking for attention. She's making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be." Layla's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to ignore the whispers. She had dealt with these kinds of insinuations her entire life. They were just another layer of the systemic bias she was fighting to dismantle. As the cabin door opened and the cool air of the jet bridge flowed in, Layla stood, gathering her belongings with deliberate precision. She stepped into the aisle, her posture straight and commanding, as though daring anyone to challenge her presence. At the exit, Miranda stood alongside Tom, their professional smiles pasted firmly in place. The insincerity in their eyes was unmistakable. Leela met Miranda's gaze, holding it for a moment longer than necessary. "You'll regret this," she said softly, her voice calm but charged with a quiet fury that made Miranda's smile falter. Tom opened his mouth to speak, but Layla had already turned away, stepping onto the jet bridge with a renewed sense of purpose. The terminal was a cacophony of motion and noise, but as Leela entered the arrivals hall, it felt as though the world had narrowed to the task ahead. Two uniformed ground staff members approached her, their expressions a blend of politeness and discomfort. This is great. I love this study, and I think our listeners and people listening, this is really important in the scope of today's episode, Kevin Wivheimer did come to Spain. Layla followed them to a small conference room tucked away from the main concourse. Inside, a manager in a neatly pressed suit awaited her, his demeanor exuding the careful professionalism of someone trained to neutralize conflicts. "Miss Brooks," he began, gesturing for her to sit. "First and foremost, I want to personally apologize for any unpleasant experience you had on board." Layla didn't sit. Instead, she placed her phone on the table and hit play on the video she had recorded during the flight. The manager's face remained impassive as he watched, but the slight twitch in his jaw betrayed his discomfort. "This," Leela said, her voice steady, "was not just an unpleasant experience. Your staff served me something that was not water, mocked me when I pointed it out, and dismissed my concerns as though I were invisible. Do you see how that might be a little more than unpleasant?" The manager cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "I understand your frustration, Miss Brooks, and I assure you we will conduct a thorough investigation into this matter." Layla leaned forward, her gaze unyielding. "I don't want your assurances. I want accountability. I want names, actions, and consequences, and I want them now." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. The manager finally nodded. "I'll escalate this to our executive team immediately. In the meantime, we'd like to offer you compensation for your experience." "Stop," Layla interrupted. "I don't want your compensation. I want change. And if I don't see it, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of company you're running." The manager hesitated, then nodded again, scribbling notes into a leather-bound planner. "Understood, Miss Brooks. We'll be in touch." Outside the terminal, the cold London air bit at her cheeks as Leela stepped into a waiting car. Her assistant had arranged the vehicle, and as she settled into the back seat, she finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She stared out the window as the city blurred past, her mind racing with the steps she needed to take. Her phone buzzed with notifications, emails, messages, and social media alerts. She opened her inbox, finding a flood of messages from colleagues, journalists, and strangers who had already seen the video she'd posted. It had gone viral, igniting a firestorm of reactions online. Some praised her courage, while others accused her of seeking attention. The comments ranged from supportive to outright hostile, but Layla didn't care about the noise. Her focus was singular, ensuring that no one else would ever have to endure what she had. As the car pulled up to her hotel, Leela sent a quick message to her legal team, outlining her next steps. She wasn't just going to fight for an apology or compensation. She was going to hold the entire system accountable, and she wouldn't stop until the skies were safe for everyone. Layla woke the next morning to the faint gray light of London filtering through the curtains of her hotel room. Her body ached with exhaustion, the weight of the previous day still pressing heavily on her. She reached for her phone, its screen lighting up with notifications, emails, texts, and countless social media alerts. Her video from the flight had spread far beyond what she could have anticipated. Overnight, her story had become a rallying cry for many and a target for others. She scrolled through the comments under her post. Among the supportive voices were sharp barbs of criticism and outright vitriol. Another millionaire trying to play the victim card? Surely, it was just a mistake. Why blow it out of proportion? How much is she hoping to get out of this? Layla clenched her jaw but refused to let the negativity distract her. For every cruel remark there were 10 messages of solidarity, many of them sharing similar experiences of discrimination, not just in the air, but across countless industries and spaces. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was David, her attorney. "Morning, Layla," David said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Have you seen the news?" "No, not yet," Layla replied, sitting up and reaching for the remote to turn on the TV. "Well, the airline released a statement early this morning," David continued. "They're calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding and claiming the video lacks context. They are framing it as an isolated incident." The TV screen lit up, displaying a morning news segment. A reporter stood outside the airline's headquarters, her voice clear and professional. The airline issued a statement today regarding a viral video shared by passenger Layla Brooks, a prominent entrepreneur. While the company expressed regret for any discomfort caused, they maintain that there is no evidence of malicious intent by their staff. The incident is currently under internal review. Layla's stomach turned as the segment shifted to an aviation expert defending the airline. "These kinds of claims often arise from miscommunication," the man said, his tone patronizing. "In the fast-pacing environment of air travel, misunderstandings happen. It doesn't necessarily indicate systemic issues." "They're already trying to discredit me," Layla muttered, gripping the phone tighter. "We expected this," David replied. "That's why we need to stay ahead. I've started compiling testimonies from others who've had similar experiences with this airline. You're not the first person to face this kind of treatment, Layla. This is bigger than you." Layla nodded, though David couldn't see her. "Send me everything you've gathered. I'm not letting this fade into just another incident." "Already on it," David said. "And Layla, don't let them intimidate you. They'll try to paint you as the problem, but you have the truth on your side." After ending the call, Layla sat in silence for a moment. Her gaze drifted to the tablet on the bedside table, where her presentation for the conference still waited. For a fleeting second, she considered focusing solely on her business, on the life she had built for herself. But the memory of Miranda's smirk and the humiliation she had endured steeled her resolve. Later that morning, Layla sat in a conference room at her attorney's London office, her expression calm but determined. David had gathered a team of associates to support the case, and the table before her was covered in files and printouts of social media posts. "This is what we found so far," David said, sliding a thick folder across the table toward her. "Over the past 5 years, there have been multiple allegations of discrimination against this airline. Most of them never made it past internal reviews. A few resulted in settlements with non-disclosure agreements." Layla flipped through the folder, her eyes scanning the detailed accounts. One was from a black woman who had been asked to deplane after another passenger accused her of being aggressive. Another described a man being denied access to the business class lounge despite holding a valid ticket. The patterns were undeniable. "Well, hasn't anyone fought back publicly before?" Layla asked. Most people don't have the resources or the platform, David explained. Settlements are quicker, quieter. The airline counts on people not wanting the fight. Well, they underestimated me, Layla said, closing the folder with a decisive snap. What's next? David leaned forward, his expression serious. The airline is going to dig into your past, looking for anything they can use to undermine your credibility. They'll probably suggest you're doing this for attention or money. Let them try, Layla said. I've got nothing to hide. David nodded. Good. We'll keep gathering evidence and building the narrative. In the meantime, I suggest you reach out to other passengers who've experienced discrimination. The more voices we have, the harder it will be for them to dismiss this as isolated. Layla agreed, and over the next few days, her team worked tirelessly to uncover more stories. Social media became a flood of testimonials from people who had faced similar indignities while flying with the airline. Some shared videos, others detailed incidents that mirrored her own experience. Being ignored, humiliated, or outright accused of wrongdoing based solely on their appearance. By the end of the week, the pressure on the airline had reached a boiling point. News outlets picked up the growing movement, framing it as a reckoning for an industry long plagued by subtle and overt discrimination. Layla appeared on a prime-time talk show, sitting opposite a host known for her incisive interviews. Ms. Brooks, the host began, your story has struck a chord with people around the world. But there are those who argue that incidents like yours are rare and don't reflect broader issues within the airline industry. How do you respond to that? Leela met the host's gaze, her voice steady. I wish this were rare. I wish my experience was just an isolated mistake. But the overwhelming number of stories I've heard since sharing mine tells a different story. Discrimination doesn't always look like outright violence or slurs. Sometimes it's the way you're ignored, the way you're made to feel invisible, or worse, like you don't belong. That's what needs to change. The audience applauded and the host leaned forward. What do you hope to achieve with this fight? Layla's expression hardened. I want accountability, not just for what happened to me, but for every person who has been dismissed, humiliated, or treated as less than. And I want the airline and the entire industry to understand that this isn't going away. As the interview aired, the airline's headquarters scrambled to contain the fallout. Internal emails leaked to the press revealed frantic attempts to mitigate the damage. One email in particular caught the public's attention. A memo instructing staff to avoid addressing issues of discrimination directly and to focus on emphasizing the airline's commitment to diversity and inclusion. The revelation only fueled the growing outrage. Activists and public figures began calling for boycotts, and the airline's stock price took a sharp hit. Layla watched it all unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and determination. This was only the beginning, and she was prepared for the long fight ahead. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. The wounds she had exposed were raw and painful, but they were necessary. Change was coming, and Layla would make sure it stayed. Layla sat in the corner office of her attorney's firm, the London skyline stretching out behind her through floor-to-ceiling windows. The atmosphere in the room was electric, charged with tension and the weight of decisions yet to be made. The table was cluttered with documents, press clippings, and printouts of social media posts. Each one bore the marks of the storm she had ignited. David paced at the far end of the room, his phone pressed to his ear. Yes, we're aware of the Countess' statement, he said, his tone clipped. No, it doesn't change our position. He paused, glancing at Leela before turning away to continue the call. Layla stared at the spreadsheet in front of her, detailing potential settlements the airline had discreetly paid to silence other claims of discrimination. Each line represented a story, a voice that had been quieted by corporate muscle. She felt the now familiar churn of anger and determination building in her chest. "Layla," David said, ending his call and stepping closer to the table. "The airline's legal team just proposed mediation. They're offering a substantial settlement to resolve this quietly." Layla's eyes narrowed. "Quietly?" she repeated. "That's their answer to everything, isn't it? Sweep it under the rug and move on." David nodded. "It's their standard playbook. They're hoping you'll take the money and let this die down." Layla pushed the spreadsheet aside and leaned forward. "I didn't come this far to settle for money. This isn't just about me, David. It's about the system they've built to protect themselves at the expense of people like me." David studied her for a moment, then nodded. "So what's your next move?" Layla took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "Oh, I'm going to buy them." The room fell silent. David blinked, momentarily stunned. "Buy them?" he repeated. "Yes," Layla said, her voice firm. "If I own the airline, I can change it. I can uproot the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. Settlements won't fix anything. Policy changes forced by public pressure won't last. The only way to truly change this system is to take control of it." David's brow furrowed. "Layla, that's ambitious. The airline is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Even with your resources, that's a massive undertaking." "I know," Layla said, "but I've run the numbers. Their stock price has taken a hit since this started. Their reputation is in shambles. Investors are nervous. If there was ever a time to make a move, it's now." David crossed his arms, considering her words. "You'd need serious backing, and even then you'd face resistance from their board." Layla smiled faintly. Good thing I've made a career out of convincing people to invest in big ideas." Over the next week, Layla threw herself into the effort. She leveraged her network of investors, partners, and allies, pitching her vision for a reimagined airline. She outlined her plans for a complete overhaul of its culture, from mandatory training on bias and inclusion to transparent systems for handling complaints. "This isn't just a business opportunity," she told one potential investor during a video call. "It's a chance to set a new standard for the entire industry. People are tired of these stories. They want to see real change, and we can lead that change." The investor, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for bold ventures, nodded slowly. "You're right about one thing," she said. "The airline industry has been resistant to accountability for too long. If anyone can shake things up, it's you. I'm in." Similar conversations played out across boardrooms and video calls, each one adding another piece to Layla's growing coalition. But the process wasn't without setbacks. Some investors were hesitant, wary of the risks involved in taking on such an established corporation. Others questioned whether Layla's personal stake in the matter would cloud her judgment. "You're making this personal," one older man said during a particularly tense meeting. "That's dangerous in business." "It is personal," Layla replied, her tone sharp. "And that's exactly why it matters. This isn't just about profit margins. It's about building something better." Meanwhile, the airline's leadership scrambled to counter her efforts. Leaks from within the company revealed frantic meetings and desperate attempts to reassure shareholders. One memo, obtained by a journalist and sent anonymously to Layla's team, described her as a serious threat to corporate stability. "They're scared," David said when he shared the memo with her. "And they should be." But the airline didn't back down easily. They launched a PR campaign aimed at rehabilitating their image, complete with ads touting their commitment to diversity and inclusion. They even brought in a high-profile spokesperson to deflect criticism. Layla watched one of the ads play on her laptop, her expression unreadable. The polished production, the carefully crafted statements, it all felt hollow. She closed the laptop and turned to David. "They're doubling down on their facade." David nodded. "It's what they do best." By the end of the month, Layla's plan was in motion. Her coalition of investors had grown, and she had quietly begun acquiring shares in the airline. The strategy was meticulous, designed to avoid alerting the company until she was ready to make her move. But the pressure was mounting. Layla's fight had made her a public figure, and the scrutiny was relentless. Every decision she made was dissected in the media, every statement analyzed for hidden motives. One evening, as she reviewed the latest financial reports in her hotel room, her phone buzzed with a text from an old friend. "Proud of you. Keep going." Layla stared at the screen for a moment, the simple message grounding her amidst the chaos. She allowed herself a rare moment of stillness, closing her eyes and breathing deeply. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been made to feel less than. The breakthrough came when a group of employees from the airline, frustrated by the company's attempts to silence internal dissent, reached out to Layla's team. They provided damning evidence of the systemic issues she had suspected all along: discriminatory hiring practices, inadequate training, and a culture that rewarded silence over accountability. "This is it," David said as they pored over the documents. "This is the leverage we need." Layla nodded, her determination hardening into resolve. "We're not just buying them, David. We're going to rebuild them from the ground up." The following week, Layla called a press conference. Cameras flashed as she stepped onto the stage, her presence commanding the room. "I didn't ask for this fight," she began, her voice steady. "But I'm not walking away from it. The airline industry has failed to address its systemic issues for too long, so I'm taking the next step." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "I am leading a coalition to acquire this airline, and when we succeed, we will set a new standard for what it means to serve every passenger with dignity and respect." The room erupted into a cacophony of questions and reactions, but Layla stood firm. She had made her move, and there was no turning back. Layla sat in the boardroom of a towering skyscraper in New York City, the heartbeat of the financial world pulsing just outside the windows. The room was filled with investors, advisors, and legal experts, all seated around a long table covered in documents, spreadsheets, and presentation slides. Her coalition had grown stronger than she could have imagined, and now they were on the brink of taking over the airline. David stood at the head of the table, gesturing toward a projection on the wall. "We've successfully acquired a controlling interest," he announced, his voice steady but charged with anticipation. "The board will meet tomorrow to finalize the transition. As of then, Layla Brooks and her coalition will assume leadership." The room erupted into murmurs and quiet applause. Layla's stomach churned with a mix of nerves and determination. This wasn't just a business deal. It was the culmination of a battle that had become deeply personal. She had fought tooth and nail to reach this moment, and now she was preparing to take on the monumental task of reshaping an entire corporation. David turned to her, his expression serious. "Layla, tomorrow is the start of a new chapter, but you need to be ready for the backlash. The current leadership isn't going to leave quietly, and the public scrutiny will only increase." Layla nodded, her hands folded tightly on the table. "Let them push back," she said. "We've come too far to let fear stop us now." The next morning, Leela arrived at the airline's headquarters. Her entrance met with a flurry of activity. Cameras flashed as reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. "Ms. Brooks, how do you plan to address the backlash from employees? Do you think this acquisition will repair the airline's reputation? Is this personal vendetta driving your decisions?" Layla didn't stop to respond. She walked purposely through the crowd, her expression calm but resolute. Inside the building, she was met by a small group of executives, their faces a mixture of apprehension and disdain. "Miss Brooks," one of them said, extending a hand, "we've been instructed to facilitate the transition. The board is waiting for you in the conference room." Layla shook his hand firmly, meeting his gaze. "Thank you," she said. "Let's get started." The boardroom was filled with tension as Leela took her seat at the head of the table. The outgoing CEO sat across from her, his expression icy. "Ms. Brooks," he began, his tone clipped, "this is an unusual situation. I must admit, I have concerns about your approach to leadership. Running an airline isn't the same as running a tech company." Leela met his gaze, her voice steady. "I understand your concerns, but let me be clear. This isn't just about running an airline. It's about transforming a culture that has allowed systemic discrimination to thrive. That change starts now." The CEO's lips tightened, but he said nothing more. The board members began reviewing the final agreements, and within the hour, the transition was official. Layla Brooks was now the owner and CEO of the airline. The first weeks of her leadership were grueling. Layla spent countless hours meeting with employees, analyzing internal reports, and addressing the damage left by years of neglect. Resistance was immediate and vocal. Many employees, particularly those in management, were skeptical of her vision and unwilling to adapt. In one tense meeting with senior staff, a manager spoke up, his tone laced with sarcasm. "So, we're just supposed to overhaul everything we've been doing because of one incident?" Layla leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "This isn't about one incident. It's about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for far too long. If you're not willing to be part of the solution, then this isn't the place for you." Her words hung heavily in the air, and the room fell silent. Layla's reforms began with sweeping changes to the airline's training programs. Mandatory bias and inclusion workshops were implemented for all employees, from entry-level staff to executives. A new system for handling customer complaints was introduced, ensuring transparency and accountability. And not everyone welcomed the changes. Layla received anonymous emails and messages accusing her of overstepping and undermining the company's traditions. Online forums buzzed with debates about her leadership, with critics questioning her qualifications and motives. One evening, as Leela reviewed reports in her office, David stopped by, holding a folder. "You might want to see this," he said, placing it on her desk. Layla opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. It was a compilation of messages from employees who had embraced her vision, thanking her for bringing change. "This one's from Clara," David said, pointing to a letter. Clara was the flight attendant who had shown Leela kindness during her fateful flight. She had since been promoted to a senior position in the customer service department. "Ah, Mr. Brooks," the letter read, "your leadership has inspired me to believe in this company again. For the first time in years, I feel proud to work here. Thank you for giving us hope." Leela set the letter down, a faint smile tugging at her lips. It was a small victory, but it reminded her why she had taken on this fight. As months passed, The airline began to see tangible results. Customer satisfaction scores improved, and employees reported higher morale. Media coverage shifted, with headlines praising Layla's bold reforms and calling her a trailblazer in the industry. One day, during a routine inspection at an airport, a young flight attendant approached Layla. "Miss Brooks," she said nervously, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you're doing means a lot. It's made a difference for people like me." Layla nodded, her voice warm. "Thank you for saying that, but the real work is just beginning." The journey was far from over. Challenges continued to arise, and the path ahead remained uncertain. But as Leela stood on the tarmac, watching one of the airline's planes take off into the clear blue sky, she felt a profound sense of purpose. She had not only fought for justice, she had taken flight, transforming an industry and proving that change, no matter how difficult, was always possible. The warm sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of the airport's VIP terminal as Layla Brooks adjusted her blazer. She stood quietly, watching a stream of passengers boarding one of her airline's freshly branded planes. The new logo, a symbol of inclusion and progress, gleamed on the aircraft's tail. It was more than a design. It was a promise. It had been a year since she had taken over the airline. The transformation had been grueling, met with resistance at every turn. But as Leela surveyed the bustling terminal, she felt a quiet sense of pride. Change wasn't easy, but it was beginning to take hold. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Mrs. Brooks, everything is ready," Clara said, her tone professional yet warm. Clara, the flight attendant who had once shown her kindness during the nightmare flight, now served as head of customer experience. She had become one of Leela's most trusted allies. "Thank you, Clara," Layla replied, her voice steady. "Let's get started." Layla was scheduled to deliver a speech to the airline's employees, marking the one-year anniversary of her leadership. She walked through the terminal, noting the subtle but significant changes. Staff members greeted passengers with genuine smiles, and there was an air of respect and attentiveness that had been sorely lacking before. As she entered the conference room, filled with employees and members of the media, the room fell silent. The audience rose to their feet, offering a round of applause that echoed against the walls. Layla stepped up to the podium, her expression calm but resolute. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice carrying through the room. "A year ago, I stood in a different room, facing a very different challenge. I didn't choose to take on this fight, it chose me. But what started as a personal battle became something much bigger. It became a mission to transform not just an airline, but an entire industry." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "This past year hasn't been easy. Change never is, but every step we've taken, every policy we've implemented, has brought us closer to the vision we set out to achieve. A company that serves everyone with dignity, respect, and fairness." The crowd nodded, a ripple of agreement passing through them. "We've faced criticism, resistance, and doubt, but we've also seen the power of perseverance. Today, our airline isn't just recovering, it's thriving. And that's because of each and every one of you." Applause erupted, filling the room. Layla waited for it to subside before continuing. "But our work isn't done," she said, her tone firm. "This isn't a victory lap, it's a milestone. The changes we've made must become part of who we are, part of how we operate every single day. And that requires all of us to stay committed, to hold ourselves and each other accountable." She ended her speech with a simple but powerful message. Together we can set a new standard for the skies. Let's continue this journey, one flight at a time. The room stood in thunderous applause as she stepped back from the podium. Clara approached her, her expression radiant. "That was perfect," she said. Layla smiled. "It's not about perfection, it's about progress, and we're getting there." Later that evening, Layla boarded a flight to New York for a business meeting. She had deliberately chosen to fly as an ordinary passenger, avoiding the perks and privacy of her position. She wanted to experience firsthand the impact of the changes she had implemented. As she settled into her seat in business class, the flight attendant approached her. "Miss Brooks, welcome aboard," he said with a warm smile. "If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Leela replied, her tone genuine. She watched as the attendant moved on to assist another passenger with the same level of care and attentiveness. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes about the progress her airline had made. Across the aisle, a young woman struggled to fit her bag into the overhead compartment. Before Layla could react, another flight attendant stepped in, offering assistance with a smile. The woman, flustered but grateful, thanked her profusely. Layla leaned back in her seat, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. It was these small acts, multiplied across thousands of flights and millions of passengers, that would define the new culture she had worked so hard to build. As the plane cruised at 300 feet, Layla reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The humiliations she had endured, the battles she had fought, and the victories she had achieved. All of it had led to this moment. She thought about the people who had supported her, the employees who had embraced her vision, and the passengers who would benefit from a better, fairer airline. Her phone buzzed softly and she glanced at the screen. It was an email from Clara sharing the results of a recent customer satisfaction survey. The numbers were higher than they had been in years, a clear sign that their efforts were paying off. Layla smiled and typed a quick reply. "Well done, Clara. Let's keep climbing." As the plane began its descent into New York, Layla gazed out the window at the city lights below. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. The fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to do, but for the first time she felt like she was flying towards something greater, something lasting. When the plane landed and the passengers began to disembark, Leela took her time, watching the crew as they wished each person a good evening. As she stepped off the aircraft, the flight attendant at the door said, "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Brooks. It's an honor to have you on board." Layla paused, meeting his gaze. "The honor is mine," she said, her voice soft but firm. Outside, the cool night air brushed against her face as she made her way to her car. She stood still for a moment, looking up at the sky. The stars were bright and endless, a reminder of the boundless possibilities ahead. Layla smiled to herself, knowing that her journey, like the sky, was just beginning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new video. Don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends to keep the conversation going. And if you're curious about other powerful stories, check out our other videos. We've got plenty to inspire and spark thought. See you in the next one.